The 2026 FIFA World Cup edges closer and closer, and as I was driving yesterday, I came across a random idea. I wanted to know what was each nation's journey to the World Cup after looking at the new nations that qualified from South America. I was like, man, how did Brazil become such a powerful nation in the World Cup? How did Australia, a nation that I lived in for 7 years and is basically my second home, how did Australia become the nation that it is today in football, that we see in AFC ever since they joined in 2006? They've qualified for every World Cup. But what was Australia's story back at the first World Cup in 1930? How did they become the nation that they did today? And honestly, I thought, right, this might be a beautiful series that I could do for each of the 48 nations at the World Cup, but at the same time I thought, let's just try the first video with Australia. I did some research, I got ChatGPT to do some deep research, I went through a flurry of articles, and let me tell you, the story of Australia is fantastic. And I have this beautiful jersey. I mean, Australia jerseys of 2006 and 2010 were fantastic. And speaking of jerseys, on YouTube Shorts, I'm doing the World Cup Jersey Challenge also ahead of the World Cup. I am trying to get invited to the World Cup to work somehow. I speak 4 languages, I connect with people from all over the world. I've even done once a challenge where I sing a song from every country in the world. So I think I'm well equipped to be at the biggest World Cup ever. And so one of the ways I'm trying to do that is the World Cup Jersey Challenge. Every nation in the world, I spin them on a random wheel. I get 4 nations per episode, and I pick the best nation to move to the next round. It's been going very well, so make sure to check out my YouTube Shorts and also vote either in the community polls or on my Instagram videos. Now, focusing on this video, Australia were isolated from world football for over 75 years. Think about it, right? Australia, if you didn't know, were actually one of the first nations to practice football. And with the wave of immigrants coming in from the 1900s all the way until later, actually even from the 1880s, the immigrants brought in a lot of football culture into Australia. But football has always been seen as an alien sport in Australia, even until today. Aussie rules, AFL and Rugby League, they always, not Rugby League, but Rugby, they try to take over football and they try to prevent it from getting as much as they possibly can. Even the A-League, it's really can only play based on what the AFL wants to do, and they try to play in the off-season of the AFL as much as they can. Obviously, the average attendance of the AFL surpasses 50,000, the A-League is around 12,000, so there's not that much interest in Australia towards soccer as there is to Aussie football. But, funnily enough, the most practiced sport in Australia is soccer. I'm gonna call it soccer just for the sake of the fact that there is Aussie football, but don't worry, I'm a football guy. Just because I lived in Australia for 7 years doesn't mean it's soccer. But Australia, when you look at the 1930 World Cup, the first ever World Cup that took place in Uruguay, where 13 teams participated in an all expenses paid trip via boat to reach there, Australia actually had a chance to participate. It was a very interesting story because if you know Australia's colonial and political past, you'll know that England had a big role to play. And indeed, even in terms of football, Australia was attached to England. Australia were represented by the English Football Association. So when England pulled out of the 1928 Olympics, which back then was the biggest football tournament you could possibly play in, due to amateurism rules, Australia pulled out too. And so when England boycotted the 1930 World Cup, Australia pulled out too. And then for around 20 years, not much happened in terms of Australia trying to get to the World Cup. They were either focusing on domestic football or, of course, dealing with the repercussions of World War II. And so we get to the 1950s. 1956 to be specific, in Australia, finally known as the Australian Soccer Football Association, the ASFA, finally joins FIFA. Now you'd think that means they're prepared to play in the qualification for the 1958 World Cup, but no, Australia would not get a chance to face a young Pele's side because Australia were trying to poach players illegally from abroad, which led them to be suspended by FIFA. And up until they created the Australian Soccer Association a few years later and paid off their outstanding fines to FIFA, they did not join. But so finally, in 1965, in preparation for the 1966 World Cup in England, they actually were able to participate in their first ever World Cup qualifier. But that year's World Cup was very interesting because CAF, the Confederation of African Football, were pretty pissed off because FIFA didn't give them a direct spot to the World Cup. And so most, if not all, African teams boycotted. And at the same time, Australia were in a group with South Korea and another team who I'll mention, and South Korea, due to logistical difficulties, were unable to play. Now, what were the logistical difficulties, you may ask? Well, Australia remained in the group with one more team, which meant that a 2-legged playoff would determine who would qualify from the AFC. That team was North Korea, hence the logistical difficulties. And actually, that game was not going to be played because Australia and North Korea could not find a place to play in. Obviously, can't play in North Korea, and the immigration laws for Australia from North Korea were very strict, so they had to find a third party to host it, and they ended up doing so in Cambodia, in Phnom Penh. And despite Les Schijnvlug scoring 2 goals for Australia across 2 legs, so 1 goal in each leg, Australia lost 9-2. Yes, North Korea thrashed Australia 9-2 and went on to perform insanely at the World Cup, but Australia would not see the World Cup dream just yet. So 1970 World Cup qualifiers come along, Australia unable to join the AFC. Yes, you might think, oh, Australia just were part of Oceania Football Federation for a long time, and so they just joined the AFC in 2006. No, funnily enough, since the 60s, Australia have been lobbying to get into the AFC, and they were unable to, isolated by the world. For some reason, AFC wouldn't accept, and FIFA wouldn't accept, and so Australia just had to do with being in Oceania. But the thing is, back then, Oceania were, how can I say, isolated anyways, right? And so you had Africa, Asia, and Oceania all combined in one sort of weird playoff. In fact, Australia in the 1970 World Cup qualifiers had to play across 3 different sides of the world. Round 1 in East Asia, Round 2 in Mozambique, and Round 3 in the Middle East. And unfortunately for them, in the Middle East was where they would lose a 2-legged playoff and not make it to the 1970 World Cup. Once again, Australia in this damned playoff, as you will come to see, the intercontinental playoffs, the bane of Australia's existence, once again came in their way. So then it was 1974. 1974 World Cup. Australia ended up making it. Australia, what? Man, I don't know why I messed that up, but I'm going to continue with the story. Australia topped their group in round 1, and in round 2, they defeat Iran, and in round 3, the final 2-legged playoff, they draw with Korea in the first leg, they draw with Korea in the second leg, and in the third leg, yes, a third leg, because back then there was no away goals, there was no extra time. Third leg to be hosted in a neutral ground in Hong Kong. Jimmy Mackay scores a 70th minute screamer for Australia to win 1-0 and qualify for their first ever World Cup in 1974, but they would exit that World Cup with no goals and just 1 point to their name. A disappointing first debut for Australia in the World Cup, but a debut at the World Cup nevertheless, and things should have shone from then on, but unfortunately Australia would continue to be exiled from the World Cup. At some point in the coming years, they joined the Oceanic Football Confederation, the OFC, which meant that Australia did not have a chance to qualify directly. In 2026, we saw New Zealand qualify directly, the first time ever that the OFC got a direct spot at the World Cup, but as long as Australia was there was never a chance. You always had to go through the Intercontinental Playoffs. So 1978 was a failure, 1982 the same, 1986 they lost to Scotland in the Intercontinental Playoff, 1990 once again failing to topple New Zealand, and in 1994 this is where it gets interesting, because Mark Schwarzer, the goalkeeper that we all know, saves 2 penalties against Canada in the first Intercontinental Playoff, and Australia make it through to Buenos Aires, Argentina, against a Maradona-led Argentina. And despite drawing with Argentina, they lose in Buenos Aires to a deflected own goal, and once again the Intercontinental Playoffs just cause Australia so much pain. But if you think that was bad, a deflected own goal against the champions of the world, not at that moment of course, but the Maradona team that did so well in the 80s. 1998 comes along and Australia face Iran at the MCG in Melbourne. The first leg was 1-1. Australia managed to face the hundreds of thousands of fans at Azadi and come out with a good result. And in the second leg at the MCG, they're winning 2-0 with 19 minutes to go. A pitch invasion from the elation of Australian fans actually catches them off guard. And within 15 minutes, Khodoadad Azizi contributes to scoring what is 2 goals for Iran, as Iran make it 2-2 and qualify on away goals to make it one of the darkest, if not the darkest day in Australian football history. You're so close. You're 15 minutes away from the World Cup and you concede 2 goals with more than 80,000 fans there. Like, how does that even work? And so we get to 2002. Australia once again make the Intercontinental Playoffs because there's no one to challenge them in the OFC. They thrashed the Solomon Islands 31-0, man. 31-0, the greatest international football scoreline of all time. Archie Thompson scoring 13 goals. And yet they go to face Uruguay and they win. But Then they lose 3-0 in the second leg in Montevideo. They could not handle it, and Australia lose 3-1 on aggregate. And now at this point, Australia trying to lobby to get into the AFC. It's not working out. Heartbreak after heartbreak after heartbreak after heartbreak. Australian football is trying to grow, but they can't even make it to the World Cup, and they're the strongest team by far in the OFC. They at least want a spot, at least a direct spot to get to the World Cup, but it doesn't work out. November 2005, November 16, 2005, Australia faced Uruguay once again in the Intercontinental Playoffs to qualify for the World Cup in Germany. And after drawing in the first leg, they lose 1-0 in the first leg in Montevideo, they win 1-0 in the second leg, and they take it to penalties. And 13 years after he saved 2 penalties against Canada in the Intercontinental Playoffs, Mark Schwarzer saves 2 penalties once again, and it's John Aloisi to take the final penalty for Australia in front of 83,000 fans at the MCG. I think it was the MCG and not the Sydney Rectangular Oval. Australia make it to the World Cup. John Aloisi scores, and after more than 1984, 1994, 2004, 30 years, after more than 30 years, Australia make it to the World Cup once again. And just 1 month later, Australia get accepted into the Asian Football Confederation, which means that would be the last time that they go through the Intercontinental Playoffs, or so they thought, but at least they would have a direct spot. And of course, who can forget the 2006 World Cup? Who can forget they were losing 1-0 to Japan? And me, as a young kid watching Australia, because my country, Lebanon, couldn't make it to the World Cup ever, I was supporting Australia, and we win 3-1. Tim Cahill, the Tim Cahill-led comeback. Australia do well against Japan. Australia even do pretty well against Brazil. And Australia draw with Croatia to make it to the round of 16, where they face the world champions Italy, the eventual world champions Italy, and they hold them until the 90th minute. But unfortunately, in what I still believe is a dive, Italy get a penalty. Francesco Totti or Daniele De Rossi, one of them, ended up scoring the goal. Italy went on to the final to win the World Cup, and Australia exited the round of 16 with their heads held high. But now they're in the AFC. That was the last time that they had to go through the grueling Intercontinental Playoffs, and when they go to the AFC, they do pretty well. Defensive masterclasses all around. 2010, they qualify. 2014, they qualify all directly. And then we get to 2018, where you think like, okay, everybody in the AFC is like, man, this Australia team, like, what the hell? We thought they were coming from Oceania, and now they're here. They're just taking our spot. And like, everyone was complaining, like, man, we need an extra spot, like, because, you know, Australia just came in and they're a strong nation, and now they've taken our spot. But in 2018, they pushed. People pushed. Saudi was no pushover. Japan was no pushover. So Japan and Saudi qualify directly, and the third place spot is a playoff. Australia faced a war-torn Syria in the playoffs, and it was a post by Omar Asuma free kick in the final minute of extra time that made sure that Australia were able to get through to the actual Intercontinental Playoff, where they would defeat Honduras to go to the 2018 World Cup. 2022 in Qatar, same thing. They weren't able to make it into the top 2. Saudi and Japan toppled them yet again, and they defeated UAE in the Asian playoff, and they defeated Peru in the Intercontinental Playoff. And once again, it was goalkeeper heroics. After Mark Schwarzer, it was Andrew Redmayne who made the penalty saves. He came on just like Tim Krul at the 2014 World Cup, and he saved the penalties and took Australia to the 2022 World Cup, where we saw them make the round of 16 again and lose to the eventual champions again, as they lost to Argentina with that classy Messi performance. 2026 though, you know, would they go again in the Intercontinental Playoff? Well, that was the question, because once again Australia were put in a group with Japan and Saudi Arabia. But this time, even though Australia were actually way more underwhelming than 2018, way more underwhelming than 2022, Australia actually qualified directly for the 2026 World Cup, one of the first nations to do so, because they were lucky enough to face a more underwhelming Saudi Arabian side. A Saudi Arabian side that were pretty good at you know, fending off Australia after their poor time in 2010 and 2014. But this time it wasn't to be for Saudi, and of course Japan, as usual. Japan just get better and better, while Australia and Saudi keep fighting each other to find out who's the second best after Japan. And so that is the story of Australia from the beginning of time, at least in the beginning of football time, up until today. And now you might ask, like, okay, so what does this all mean? Why are you telling this story? Well, look, as somebody who lived in Australia, of course, I have a genuine connection to this with the Socceroos. I've always supported them at the World Cup. They've been my go-to team alongside Saudi Arabia, because Saudi Arabia is the place I live in right now, and it's always been a connection I have. And of course, when Saudi do eventually hopefully qualify, I'll tell you their story. But Australia, man, especially, it's a rare kind of country, right? You've been isolated from the world for so long, whether in qualifiers, whether not being able to make the AFC, or not being able to make FIFA, or because you had to go through England, or because you had to go through Intercontinental Playoffs. Like, bro, going from Melbourne to Montevideo, or Melbourne to Buenos Aires, or Melbourne to Mozambique, bro. They actually went to Mozambique, man. Imagine going to, like, bro, I want to know, what the flight was like in 1970. How did Australia, like, come on, that should have been some reason. Like, Australia, how did they get from Australia to Rhodesia, man? Or no, it wasn't Mozambique, sorry, Zimbabwe was Rhodesia, but still Mozambique, right? It's not like it's South Africa where Australia and South Africa, I think they have direct flights now. It's Mozambique, man. Not many people go from Australia to Mozambique or Mozambique to Australia, right? But Australia and football have a weird relationship because no matter the fact that it's the most practiced sport in Australia right now between the youth, no matter that it's growing and they made the professional league in 2006 and the A-League is growing and now they have the Australian National Second Division and the National Premier Leagues are doing very well and even Australia are performing very well. But see, Australia doesn't just have to get respect from the world. Like you guys go like, oh, Australia calls it soccer. We want respect from the world. No, Australia even needs to get respect within Australia because people within Australia still see it as an alien sport. Even when Australia qualified for the World Cup, even though you see hundreds of thousands of fans in the streets of Australia celebrating, it still doesn't get the respect that rugby or AFL does. And rugby and AFL are only watched in Australia or by Australian expats outside of Australia, right? But millions of people around the world watch the Australian national soccer team or the Socceroos, right? And yet still it does not get the same amount of respect. And so that's what the World Cup means to Australia and Australian football fans, right? Australia, if they do poorly at the World Cup, everybody in the Australian media is going to be like, see, why should we care about soccer, mate? Bloody rugby, bloody AFL. No, they don't say the AFL, they say bloody footy, mate. 50, ball, you know, like stuff like that. But if Australia get to the quarterfinals, if Australia did what Morocco did at 2022, you 100% believe that the Australian government is going to be like, yeah, mate, going to invest $50 million. Yeah, ever since I left Australia, my accent has become worse and I speak in the more Lebo accent. So like, yeah, $50 million, mate, cuz, yeah, cuz, all right, cuz. So Australia, the Australia government, cuz, if Australia made it to the semi-finals in front of instead of Morocco, yeah, no, Australia, see, this is when you live in a country like now, my Saudi Arabic accent is so much better because I live between Saudis. But when I'm in Australia, I speak like a full-on Aussie, cuz. And the Aussies will tell ya that this is not an Aussie accent, but I'm Lebanese. And the Lebanese Australians, how do they speak? They say, shoo baby, shoo cuz, you want to go get a kebab? Alright, too much racist stereotype towards my own people. But yeah, if Australia win the World Cup, do very well at the World Cup, and it ripples back onto the population, the government will support it more, they will fund it more. And the reason Australia doesn't have promotion and relegation is because the government did so poorly, or the governing body of football in Australia did so poorly in trying to manage it, and also not understanding the logistical difficulties and how big the nation is. And it's just very financially unviable to make Australia a promotion relegation system, even though there's literally a club from the second division that has never been promoted to the A-League that's in the final of the Australian Cup right now after defeating 3 A-League teams. And yet, most of the people in my comments when I made a video about Heidelberg United, they said, no, we can't have promotion relegation. It's just not feasible. It's just not plausible. And this is why the World Cup is important to Australia. This is why this series is important to me. This is why the World Cup is important to me. The World Cup has long been a thing for people to connect from all over the world. Like, it was my first ever tournament that I watched was the 2006 World Cup, which Australia obviously qualified to. And seeing my family, my aunts, my grandmas, my uncles, people who didn't care about football watch the World Cup because it's the World Cup and what football meant to the world and how it's the biggest representation of nations in the world besides the Olympics, and I would even say even more than the Olympics, because it's a team sport, right? Australia is playing, not one athlete from Australia, right? It's the whole team. Like, this one team represents them and not just 200 different athletes. So for me, the World Cup is so important, and the World Cup is beautiful, and I hope I didn't take too long, and I hope you enjoyed the story of Australia. And if you'd like me to see me do this about other nations, I would love to do so, and hopefully I didn't waffle or yap too much. This was all off the cuff, and I hope you enjoyed it. I hope I won't make any mistakes next time, and I hope you enjoy even the view behind me. If you think that I should get any new national team jerseys, let me know, because we will do so. Thank you very much, guys, and see you soon.